Hello there! Welcome to Skanky Production. I'm Crown Goes Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our Disney series. In today's video we're going to be looking at none other than Old Yeller from 1957. So if you like what you've seen already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to check out the many other videos in this playlist. I promise that you will not be disappointed. And also we have to give a shout out to everyone who left a comment in the last video, so big shout out to you guys. And if you want a shout out in the next video, then don't forget to obviously leave a comment in the comment section of this video. So for those of you who haven't seen our channel already, we have this video split into 6 different parts. So we have the story of the story, the story of the creator, the story of the studio, the themes and the history, the legacy, and any notable lines and notable effects within the film. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into the story of the story, so buckle up and let's go for the ride. So our story starts with one of my favourite Disney songs of all time, before we open up to see Travis and Arliss, who are the children of Jim Coates and his wife Katie, and they're living in the late 1860s in Texas. So Jim has to go on a cow drive to Kansas, which leaves Travis as the man of the house. And one day, while he's working the cornfield, he encounters a yellow dog that scares his mule, and he calls the dog Old Yeller because of the yellow coat that he has and the bark that he has, which also sounds like a man yelling. Now the dog keeps on stealing meat, but Arliss, the little son, ends up defending him, and so they end up taking him in, despite Travis's opposition. So later on, Travis goes out hunting and he hangs the meat up to tempt Old Yeller, so he has an excuse to shoot him, but Old Yeller proves his worth, and so Travis begins to be won over by the dog. So the next day, Arliss feeds a bear cub and tries to capture it, but of course the mum ends up coming. But Old Yeller saves the day, and also we should say that no animals were hurt in the making of this film. We'll talk more on that a little bit later. But this here fully ends up winning over Travis because of course he saved his younger brother. Now later on, Bud Searchy and his daughter Lisbeth come to supper, and Lisbeth warns Travis that Yeller has been stealing food all around town, and he's also impregnated Lisbeth's dog, which is why she won't snitch. And actually we have to say that this is a first for Disney films. If you've watched our series so far, you will know that many of the characters end up snitching. And so this is the very first in terms of Disney history of a character not snitching. But as punishment, Travis ends up making Old Yeller stay up in order to watch the cornfields to protect them against raccoons. And the next day, Yeller helps to keep Rose the cow in check so that Travis can bring back the calf, and also so that he can milk Rose. Now one day, Yeller's old master, Bern Sanderson, comes back for the dog. But Arliss trades the dog for a horny toad and for a cooked meal from his mum, which, in my opinion, I don't necessarily think is a fair deal, but, Bern Sanderson is obviously quite a nice chap. And so this is where Sanderson also warns about rabies going around. So again, this is foreshadowing like a mofo. Now the next day, they end up going hog hunting, and Travis climbs up a tree just like Bud taught him. Before, he ends up falling, and the both of them end up getting injured by some hogs, and so he makes Old Yeller crawl into a cave so that Travis can go and get his mum to go and stitch him up. Now Bud comes back and he warns about rabies, and he ends up leaving Lisbeth with them, and once Travis is well again, he has to shoot a cow because it has rabies, and again this is even more foreshadowing. And later that night, a wolf jumps them, and Old Yeller ends up defending the family against the rabid wolf, but in the process of this, he ends up getting bitten, and this means that he ends up turning crazy, and Travis has to come to terms with the fact that he'll have to shoot him too, especially after Arliss almost ends up getting attacked by Old Yeller. So this here is one of the saddest moments in all of film history, and this is where Travis ends up having to put Old Yeller down. So the next day, Jim comes back with gifts and with money that he's got from the cow drive, and this is where he and Travis have a very deep conversation. And this is where he basically helps him with the grieving process. And so this is where we see one of Old Yeller's pups, and he's stealing a bit of meat. And at this point here, Travis realizes that the spirit of Old Yeller lives on within his pup, and this pup here ends up becoming young Yeller. And so with this, the film ends happily ever after. So that obviously is a very touching film. If you haven't seen it already, highly recommend that you watch it. And of course, yeah, spoiler alert, like obviously the film came out many decades ago, so grow up. Like, you should have had this when you were a child. If you didn't have this as a child, then that's your problem. But anyway, now we've covered the story of the story, and we've kind of ruined the story for many of you crybabies. Now we have to talk about the story of the creative process that went into the making of this masterpiece. So Old Yeller was a children's novel from 1956, and it was written by Fred Gibson, who ended up receiving a Newbery Honour in 1957, and he also wrote a sequel, which was Savage Sam. So this book came out in 1962, and was later turned into a film in 1963. Although we probably won't cover it within the course of this channel's history, because the film was relatively minor. And also we should say that there was another book which came out posthumously, and this was called Little Arliss. So this is focusing on the younger son. And this came out 5 years after he died, so this came out in 1978. So Old Yeller was originally based off of a dark-coloured border collie called Rattler. So unlike Yeller, which in the film is a mongrel mix of a Labrador and a Mastiff, so you can tell that I don't really know much about dogs because I had to read that several times. So yeah. So anyway, so originally it was meant to be a border collie, but in this it's a mongrel breed between a Labrador and a Mastiff. Now the stories were kept largely identical, as Fred ended up being the co-writer for the script for this, along with William Turnberg. So William Turnberg, his brother, was the one who wrote Ben-Hur's screenplay. So he's the less famous brother writer, but still. So as a result of Fred Gibson being a co-writer, this is essentially why the story is essentially the same, whether you look at the book or whether you look at the film. So that covers the story of the story, and now in terms of the story of the studio. So in terms of the story of the studio, I highly recommend that you watch The Making of Walt Disney's Old Yeller, 1957, which is narrated by Fess Parker. So more on him a little bit later. So within that, it explains that Walt Disney was very much influenced when he was growing up, because in Missouri, where he was from, you end up having some Civil War vets, right? So some of them were Union troops, some of them were Confederate. And so as a result of this, he was very much influenced by this, and also with stories of the West. So within the living lifetime of Walt Disney when he was growing up, there were, the memories of the Civil War and of like the American West were still very present in people's minds. And so he wanted to make stories which touched on both of these major themes. So you can see this already with the Song of the South, and you can see this with many other stories as well. So this is part of the reason why it's based in late 1860s Texas, because it's still in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it's still very much tied up with the frontier myth. So more on that a little bit later when we talk about the themes in the history. But in terms of the casting now, we should say that most of the actors who were in this were people who tended to be in many of Disney's TV shows. So during the 1950s, he kind of focused more on making short things for TV, but also some of these actors were also in some minor films. So first of all, we have to talk about Fess Parker, who we just mentioned. So Fess Parker, he was most famous for playing Davy Crockett in the TV series of that time. But within this, he plays Jim Coates, who is, of course, the dad. Next, we have to talk about Tommy Kirk. So he is Travis in this, and he also appeared in The Shaggy Dog, and later would appear in the sequel of Old Yeller, which, of course, as we've mentioned, is Savage Sam. So this came out in 1963. However, I should say this is very important. Tommy ended up being fired by Disney in 1963 because it was discovered that he was gay. So in this time, obviously, it was illegal in most places in America to be homosexual. And basically, Tommy, as a 21-year-old at this point, he ended up being, outed, let's put it this way. So Disney ended up firing him, and he ended up actually rehiring him only because there was a certain film that he was in, which was The Misadventures of Merlin Jones, which came out in 1963. So this film here ended up becoming a hit. And so as a result of that, that's why he, for a short time, rehired him. It's actually a very, very dark story. And actually, if you watch the film again, knowing that Travis is, the actor that plays Travis is gay, it gives you a very different perspective. But we'll talk more on that a little bit later when we talk about the themes and the history. So moving on now to the next actor, and this is the person who plays Arliss, and this is Kevin Kakarin, who we mentioned in the previous video. So he was just in some minor films other than this, and he also ended up later in life becoming a TV producer and a TV director. Next you have the mum, who is of course Katie, and this was played by Dorothy Maguire. So she ended up being in A Gentleman's Agreement from 1947, and was also the mum in The Swiss Family Robinson, which we're going to cover within the next video, so more on that a bit later. Next you have Jeff York, and he is the person who plays Bud, and he was just a minor actor who actually appeared in some quite major films, so we have this on screen at the moment. Next you end up having Beverly Washburn, and she is the person who plays Elizabeth, and she was just a minor actor who was in quite minor films other than this. And then finally, in terms of humans, you have Chuck Connors, and he plays Bern Anderson. And so he actually, within his career, was a writer, a basketball player, a baseball player, and was also a minor actor, most notably a TV actor, especially in the TV show The Rifleman, where he was the star. And then finally, of course, we have to talk about Spike the dog. So Spike, he's the one who plays Old Yeller, and actually he appeared in many other films as well. So originally, Spike was actually meant to be put down, but actually he ended up being a rescued dog, and therefore, even in his very short life, he ended up appearing in many, many different things, and I think his legacy, it really touches the hearts of many, many people, and will do for many centuries to come. So that covers the story of the studio, but now we have to talk about the themes and the history within this. And actually, of the many different themes, the most notable I would have to say is that of the American West. So the American West is obviously something which is ever present in the minds of many American people, both in those times and also even to this day to a limited extent. And especially for people living in the 1950s, you had many, many different Western films which came out around that time. And this is because we're in living memory. Many people still would have remembered what it would have been like fighting Indians and basically, being out on the frontier. And so at the time when this is set, it's still, they've obviously settled, but they still remember what it's like having Indians. And this is why, for instance, Arliss is running about with a Native American headgear, because of course, this is the time that it was. Also as well, we have to talk about the fact that it's the post-Civil War world. So of course, Texas, like many other places within the South, was highly devastated as a result of the Civil War, and especially because the currency which they had was essentially worthless because of hyperinflation, and also the fact that there was no Confederate government to back these things up. And this is actually said right at the very beginning of the film when Arliss and Travis are talking, but of course, they're two young boys, they wouldn't really understand anything to do with what the Confederacy was even. And also, this is part of the reason why Jim, their dad, has to go on these cattle drives as well as all the other men. And actually, if you look at the John Wayne film from 1948, which is Red River, highly recommend that you watch it. It's an absolute classic. We haven't seen it before. But again, this basically looks at the same sort of thing. So essentially, this film is almost the same story of Red River, but just told from the perspective of the women and children who stay behind, as opposed to the men who go out on the drive. And again, this is something which is really noticeable within this, which is that I think the major theme is that of gender. So if you have a drinking game, for every single time that they mention the word man or men or woman in this, right, or something along those lines, you will be all over the place, right? Because this film is very typical of the film from the 1950s, where it's the reinforcement of gender norms, right? So, the men, they go out to work, they have to go on the cattle drives, the women and children have to stay behind. And actually, there's many different lines in this year which it's reinforced again and again. So for instance, Bud has been asked to stay behind to protect the women folk. You also have Bern, and he talks explicitly about a woman cooked meal, as opposed to a man cooked meal, which was a bit, is not as good as a woman cooked meal is going to be. And also, Jim says to the boys, take care of your mother in front of her. So it's not even like, she's a full grown adult. They're little children. And yet he is saying that because you guys are boys, it's your job to protect your mother, as opposed to the other way around, where the mother is the one protecting the boys, right? So these kind of themes of like how strongly these gender norms are being kind of reinforced, I think it really would have had an impact on Tommy Kirk. And actually, if you watch the film again, knowing that, you know, he's actually gay, it has a very different perspective on this, because you can see that, you know, Tommy Kirk ended up really struggling with his sexuality and really struggling with, you know, what it meant to be a man in those days, especially where these gender norms are so strongly being reinforced. And actually, this is part of the reason why he ended up becoming an addict. He ended up becoming, you know, had all sorts of mental health issues, yeah, as a result of this, where this kind of almost toxic masculinity, yeah, I hate to use that term, but it's almost being like reinforced at like a really hyper level. So again, I really highly recommend that you watch the film again with that in mind, and then kind of see what, you know, what it's like. Like, yeah, it's all good, like kind of like men and women having kind of traditional roles, but where there's an exception to that, that has some, you know, that's something which has to be borne in mind. So what if Disney himself was not that progressive on that issue of LGBT, you know, in stark contrast to how it is nowadays with Disney? What he was well ahead of his time with is, as we said with regard to Dumbo, as we said with regard to Bambi, he was well ahead of his time in terms of animal welfare. So we'll talk about this in a bit more detail when we talk about the notable lines and notable effects. But it should be noted that, like I said, there's no animals that were harmed in the making of this. And the reason is because, you know, the animals, they were actually friends with each other, right? So these were stage animals, and they were basically trained by their trainers to act in a certain way to be, you know, whilst they're on camera. And actually, it's a thing where one of the representatives from the American Humane Association was there throughout the entire filming of this to make sure that none of the animals were injured during the making of this film. So that's actually something which, again, is very progressive. I don't think at the time films necessarily had to adhere to those standards, but most likely they're not. I think that Walt Disney would have done this on the insistence that if you're going to have animals, and actually some of these, you know, some of the animal fights in this look really spectacular on camera, but it's all done humanely, and it's all, you know, it's all done properly. So that's something to really note. And actually, this ties in with the legacy of the film. So this film here is very much a coming of age kind of story. So many people, especially boomers, this is a real like touching story for them. And you know, Old Yeller ended up dying. You know, there's something which many people had when they were growing up, and all their life they still remember Old Yeller, right? And it's really annoying that I wasn't able to find a budget for this film, but in terms of box office, it did very well. So it made 6.25 million at the box office in US and Canada, and later on, when it had a re-release in 1965, it garnered an extra $2 million. And actually, I think that the film could probably be done today. I think minus some of the more problematic things, or maybe if they made the problematic things, but like, you know, they made more jokes about it and, you know, showed that the men is whatever. I think that it could actually be redone today. And although, would they necessarily have the same kind of animal scenes? I think they probably would have done CGI with that if they did it again. But that's actually a film I wouldn't mind Disney remaking, actually, if they did it properly. So that's what I have to say with regard to the legacy of it, and talking about the notable lines and notable effects. To talk about the notable effects, the animal scenes in that is actually all scripted, like we said. So, you know, they're stage animals, they're actually friends, and actually just outside of the camera range, you actually had the two trainers who were actually yelling instructions to the animals to basically put on a good show. However, you don't actually hear that because you had the use of sound effects. So this part of the documentary that was done on the making of Old Yeller is really, really good, yeah, because it explains how sound effects were used, especially if you have the bear, for instance, which is
an old lamp chimney.
So you can see how they actually did that and how they actually made all of these sound effects. And now we have to talk about the notable lines within this. So you have many, many different notable lines, although the film wasn't really meant to be a funny film. So it's meant to be quite deep. It's meant to be, you know, imparting wisdom upon young boys in particular. So the lines in it are a bit deeper than you would have in a regular Disney film. So for instance, you have this.
Jumper, you jughead. A bunch of bob whites, and you act like you ain't got the brains of a blind goose in a hailstorm.
And you have this.
And there's about 1 million other fish, and they all tried to eat me, and I had to throw rocks at them.
And then there's these two big snakes, and
Sounds like that cottontail you wrote this morning.
And you have this.
mind your own business.
Get out of there! Quit chucking them rocks at me!
And you have this.
I kind of figured to hate up that cow drive to Kansas myself. But when man after man called me off, spoke private like, begging me to stay behind, look out after you women folks and the young ones, I seen my duty.
And you have this.
But I'll tell you a trick, it's sometimes a big help. When you start looking around for something good to take the place of the bad, as a general rule, you can find it.
So as you can see, it's a really great film. If you haven't watched it already, I highly recommend that you watch it. And whether you liked it or not, obviously, of course, what you can do is hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to leave a comment in the comment section for this video so that, of course, you get a shout out in the next video. And the next video we're going to do is Swift Family Robinson from 1960. So I haven't seen the film for a long time. So I hope that you join me on that journey. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.